All right, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. We'd like to begin. My name's Brett Scharfs, and I'm the director of the International Center for Law and Religion Studies. And it's hard to believe, but I'm now here to welcome you to our closing session of the 25th Annual International Law and Religion Symposium. We're grateful for all of the presentations that have been made, and the richness and variety and depth and level of preparation that we have seen here this week has really been heartening. We're very grateful to those who have traveled from great distances to be here with us. This afternoon, as we close, we're going to proceed as follows. I'm going to speak just a few minutes about some issues that I've been really worried about over the last year or so, that I've been really planning and preparing to share with this group for about a year since our last symposium. And I apologize that you already heard from me today. That was an accident of our scheduling and needing to reshuffle delegates whose travel plans had changed. But I'm going to begin by speaking for about 20 minutes, and then we've invited about a half dozen of you to come up and just share your reflections on reactions, impressions, feelings that you've had over the symposium this year. We've asked you to focus specifically on ideas of what to do as a result of what we've heard and learned here. And we apologize that we're not able to invite each of you up to speak to the group. We've tried to choose geographically, linguistically, from a variety of areas of the world and different backgrounds, just some representative voices to reflect. And we've just asked each of these people to speak for 2 or 3 minutes to share their reflections of something they learned, or some new insight they've had, or some specific plan of action that they are leaving the symposium with. I'll then invite them to return to their seats, and I'll ask my colleagues Elizabeth Clark and Cole Durham to join me here in front. And I've asked Professor Durham, our founding director, to give us some closing reflections. He's been listening carefully over the last 2 days, and I've asked him to just pull together the strands of what he's heard and leave with us some final thematic impressions. I'll then invite our Associate Director and Principal Planner of this conference, Elizabeth Clark, to be our final speaker. And she will mostly want to express thanks to a lot of people. So that's the plan. We will be finished by about 5 o'clock, and then you can make your way back. The vans will be available to take you back to the hotel, and our closing dinner tonight is at 7 p.m. right in the hotel. So just down the elevator into the ballroom, as convenient as we can make it. And then, of course, tomorrow for the delegates, we have a really interesting day with field trip to the Humanitarian Center, a tour of Temple Square, and then what for many is one of the real highlights of our week together, the opportunity to have a lunch hosted by the First Presidency and the Quorum of the 12 Apostles of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. So that's our plan. I hope that it's clear. If it's not, just ask the students. That's what I do when I'm unsure where to be, and they always get me to the right place. So if it works for me, I hope it will work for you as well. All right. So as you can see, I've begun with a slide. This is taken from the same vantage of where our group photo was taken today. I mentioned before to some of you that when the pioneers came here to Utah, they came for the protection of that range of mountains that you saw driving up to Salt Lake City. They were fleeing persecution. And we hope that now when we as a community do not suffer persecution in the way that we have in the past, that we will be sensitive to those who still suffer persecution and discrimination around the world. What I would like to talk about today is responding to strategies for marginalizing religious freedom. I've chosen these words carefully because it may be that sometimes these strategies are not conscious or overt, but I'm afraid that sometimes, and to an extent I'd rather not have to admit, they are conscious and overt. And so what I want to reflect upon is how we can respond to various trends or impulses which marginalize freedom of religion and belief. When I say freedom of religion, I mean freedom of religion and belief. It's not, of course, limited to overtly religious belief systems. Why is it that religion and religious freedom seem to be under such strain? We could think of a lot of reasons. In many parts of the world, secularism, including aggressive, proselytizing secularism, seems to be on the rise. We also see pressures of globalization and the materialism that is associated with a world where economic progress and economic gain seems so important. We also see assertive atheism that is quite confident that religion and religious people are at the heart of most of what is wrong with the world. We also see the internet and different ideas of expertise, whereas generations ago we may have gone to the elders of our village or our community for guidance and wisdom. Our children have a very different idea of where to go to find answers. And I think it's not just our children. I think that we too have become very adept at turning to sometimes anonymous and sometimes unknown voices for answers to our questions. We see the replacement of communities with virtual communities, people gathering in ways that perhaps expose them primarily people who have a shared interest or a shared identity, rather than coming together in communities of difference where we try to learn to live with people who might not agree with us about everything. We also see violent religious extremism. We've seen this in a variety of places around the world, religious nationalism, and scandals and cover-ups resulting in crisis of authority for many religious groups. My focus today is going to be on law and how it interfaces with religion. How does legal doctrine contribute to the pressures on religion? I'm going to focus on 7 tendencies or currents, movements, what I've called in my title strategies for marginalizing freedom of thought, conscience, and religion. And I'll then suggest 3 approaches for responding to these tendencies, currents, or strategies. Strategy number 1 is the public-private distinction and the relegation of religion to private life, reserving the public sphere for the secular. Now, the public-private distinction is an old distinction, but it's clear that protection of freedom of religion and belief, whether in the First Amendment with its discussion of free exercise, or in the human rights instruments with its attention to manifestations of religion and belief, both in public and private, did not think that there was a dividing line between public and private that was equivalent to the dividing line between where religion was appropriate and inappropriate. Now, limitations may work somewhat differently in public and private. There may be different ways in which we limit manifestations of freedom of religion and belief based upon the principle of necessity, the principle of proportionality, the principles of least restrictive means. But clearly the right to freedom of religion and belief extends to public as well as private spheres. Strategy number 2 is the belief-action distinction. Here, the move is to argue that religion is a matter of belief, and actions should be subject to secular legal norms, such as non-discrimination requirements. Now, again, this is an old distinction, going back in the United States to the early Mormon polygamy cases. But by its very name, the free exercise of religion announces that it includes actions as well as beliefs. The forum externum suggests that human rights and freedom of religion and belief is relevant in the forum of external affairs and not just in the world of conscience. Sometimes these are described as paragraph 1 and paragraph 2 rights. But notice, both are rights. Again, limitations may work somewhat differently, but when we have religious motivations for actions, manifestations of religion should be limited only when the specific bases for limitations on religious practice are met. In the European Court context, for example, this means that it's based on one of the 5 legitimating reasons for limiting religious freedom, but most importantly, that it's also necessary to limit religious freedom in those ways. It's not enough to simply say that, oh, this is a matter of action, and so it's no longer a matter of religion because it's not solely in the realm of conscience. Strategy number 3 is to characterize religion as discrimination. Living one's religious convictions is sometimes characterized as discrimination. In the United States today, we often see religious freedom in scare quotes, and religious freedom is treated as a pretext for discrimination. For example, in the wedding vendor cases with which we are familiar. But this is usually a mistake. It turns out that there is differential treatment of secular and religious conscience. When bakers did not want to bake a cake based on secular conscience, they were not forced to do so. But when bakers wanted to decline to bake a cake based on religious conscience, that conscience was viewed as not worth protecting. The reality is sometimes we have religious reasons for religiously motivated actions. I think we should stop talking about the right to discriminate when we're talking about the right to live one's convictions. For example, when a synagogue hires a rabbi who is Jewish, it is not discriminating against Catholics, although that's how it's characterized in U.S. law. We basically say you can't discriminate on the basis of religion, and then we give an exemption to churches so that they can discriminate on the basis of religion. Now, this is an insidious move, because what we've done is we've now characterized Catholics hiring a Catholic priest for their parish as religious discrimination. That's not religious discrimination, that's living your faith. And we wouldn't think of calling it discrimination when a gay rights group hires someone who is a gay rights advocate for their group, even though they're discriminating against all the people who are not gay rights advocates. We just don't use the same language in other contexts, but somehow when it comes to religion, we're stuck in this idea of talking about people who are acting out of religious reasons as acting based on discrimination. The fourth problem is characterizing religious accommodations as exemptions. There's a tendency to think of religious needs as exemptions from general and neutral rules. This might be an exemption for dietary needs or for military service, or an exemption from a no hats rule to accommodate a yarmulke or a headscarf. The problem of this way of thinking is we don't speak of exemptions when we vindicate other rights. When we vindicate free speech, free press, free association, other First Amendment rights in the United States, we say these laws are unconstitutional. We say these laws are overbroad, or they're unconstitutional as applied. But for some reason, when we're in the realm of free exercise, we say, well, do we have to give an exemption? And this is just, I think, insidious that we still think about it in this way. There are a couple of other bases of responding. One is that treating people equally sometimes requires us to take into account their differences. We see this in a great, famous, lovely case from South Africa known as the Pillay case, where a young Hindu girl wanted to wear a nose stud that was a violation of the school's dress and grooming standards. And the court upheld her right based on the principle of equality. Now that's remarkable because the rule applied to everyone equally. No one could wear jewelry. But what the South African court recognized is sometimes to treat people equally, we have to take account of their differences. Not to give them an exemption, but to treat them equally. Isn't that a better way of thinking about the needs that some of us have based upon our religious commitments? We should also recognize that exceptions to rules are ordinary and usual. For example, we have a minimum wage law, but it doesn't apply to a variety of places. It doesn't apply in schools or apprenticeships. Sometimes there are other important exemptions as well. There is a lot of debate in the United States about the health care law and the contraception mandate. Well, interestingly, the health care law didn't apply to any business with less than 50 employees. Most Americans work for businesses with less than 50 employees. We didn't think of this as some devastating exemption to the law, and yet when the Little Sisters of the Poor, who had more than 50 employees, wanted to be exempt from the contraception mandate, this was treated as a First Amendment issue. It created a First Amendment crisis, and they had to go all the way to the Supreme Court to vindicate their right. I mean, think about this. Catholic nuns had to go to the Supreme Court. The Little Sisters of the Poor, who spent all of their energy ministering to people who are homeless and destitute, and yet their exemption, their seeking an exemption was seen as some sort of great constitutional anomaly that was really problematic. Why is it problematic to recognize the needs of the Little Sisters of the Poor when we already recognize the needs of businesses with less than 50 employees, which is something like 3/4 of all businesses in the United States? It's hard not to view what was going on as a type of targeting and animosity towards religion and towards the Little Sisters of the Poor. So my point is simply that exceptions to rules are ordinary and usual. We have a rule, like a speed limit, but we don't apply it when someone's rushing to the hospital with a mother delivering a baby or to someone in an extreme emergency. We don't have to think of that so much as an exemption as just an ordinary exception to rules of general applicability. It seems to me that we have learned many lessons from accommodating the special needs of those with special needs, including from disability law. But for some reason in the area of free exercise, we treat the need for an exemption as an unfortunate violation of the principle of equality. I just think that that over-characterization is really unfortunate. Strategy number 5 is to describe freedom of religion as freedom of worship. President Obama often spoke about freedom of worship, almost always as a way of narrowing or minimizing religious freedom. This is another way of relegating freedom of religion and belief to private life. Well, how do we respond? Well, the First Amendment speaks of free exercise of religion. It doesn't speak of freedom of worship. The international human rights documents talk about the freedom to manifest religion in teaching, practice, worship, and observance. So limiting it to worship is already a narrowing, which is hard to view as something other than a tactic designed to limit the scope of the freedom. Freedom of worship, of course, is part, but it is not the entirety of religious freedom. Pressures towards privatization of religion sometimes rest upon Protestant assumptions of how salvation takes place. But even Protestants will argue that, of course, freedom of religion includes the free exercise of religion. Strategy number 6 is to view religion as extremism, to view religion as a security threat, resulting in what we have sometimes called the securitization of religion. This, of course, is especially pertinent in the post-9/11 world over the last decade and a half. There are a number of strategies for responding to this mistake, including making sure that we always point out that extremism is not the same as violent extremism, and that conservative, orthodox, or fundamentalist views are not the same as extreme views, and that being observant is not the same as being conservative. The point of these non-equivocations is to point out that violent extremism is different than virtually every other type of religious expression. Partly, we need better religious responses to religious rationales for violence. Violence motivated by Islam, for example, will be countered better and more persuasively by accounts of Islam that are stronger and more authentic than the distorted versions of Islam which would be used to justify violence. And of course, mostly these arguments are going to need to be provided by insiders of the various faith traditions. We need to also avoid the tendency to hold groups responsible for the acts of individuals and subgroups. None of us who are white Americans would want to be blamed for the actions of a few white supremacists. And we would think it absurd if anyone tried to say we were all responsible. And yet we do something like that to Muslims pretty regularly when we tried to hold groups responsible in some way for the actions of a few extremists within the group. The final strategy I want to discuss is religion as abuse. We've been rocked once again, as we were a decade or so ago, with reports of the child sexual abuse scandals, not just in the Catholic Church, but beyond. And there are voices that are trying to argue that religion is inherently abusive. How do we respond to this? Well, we need better legal responses that can vindicate victims without bankrupting dioceses. One of the problems that occurs is sometimes the cost of acknowledging fault is so high that it becomes an entrenched mentality that you can't admit fault at all. Religious groups need to develop responses that prioritize ending ecclesiastical roles for abusers and enablers. And we need to find strategies for addressing historical wrongs and seeking reconciliation within communities. So let me conclude with 3 final observations of additional things that we can do to try to respond to these strategies for marginalizing religion and freedom of religion. The first is to speak always of freedom of religion and belief. Those of us who are religious need to get better at making sure that when we speak of religious freedom, we are always including those whose conscientious convictions are not religious in the way that we commonly think. We need to seek strategies for building bridges between religious human rights communities and secular human rights communities. And we need to seek strategies for the mutual vindication of competing rights claims, such as non-discrimination claims and freedom claims. Second, we need to use the best of faith to defeat the worst of religion. The best answer to bad religion is almost always going to be good religion. Those in faith traditions whose traditions are distorted and abused must seek resources within our own traditions to address the problems that are made in our names. We all need to be willing to look to the lessons and approaches of other religious traditions. Finally, strategy number 3, I've discussed already here, and that is the idea of trying to promote human dignity for everyone everywhere. The idea that we must always be concerned about the foundational root reality that all people have human dignity, and that we need to seek strategies to vindicate and protect their dignity in all contexts, in all places. So what we see is a variety of strategies which exist that have been used to marginalize religion in the last decade or two. Defenders of religion and religious freedom, we must recognize that the challenges today are quite different than they were 20 years ago. We need to be aware of subtle changes in legal doctrines and presumptions. Defenders of religion and religious freedom must respond to ways of framing the issues that recharacterize the importance of freedom of religion and belief. What you'll notice about each of these 7 problems that I've identified, they're all framing devices. And we have to frame in order to understand the world. Otherwise, we're just overwhelmed by the amount of data around us. But the frames we choose, we want to understand when we're choosing them, and if they are distorting the reality that's taking place outside of the frame, we need to be ready to respond to that as well. Well, I hope you'll forgive me for taking this time at the end of this conference, but I've really been losing sleep over the status of freedom of religion and belief in public discourse over the last few years. I've begun to feel, in a way I haven't felt earlier in my life, that religious freedom is a fraught term, that it's contestable and is politicized, that sometimes it even seems to be a partisan issue. And that's not good for anyone. I mean, we noticed back when the Religious Freedom Restoration Act was adopted, it was unanimous, virtually unanimous, in both the House and the Senate, signed by Bill Clinton. Correct me if I'm getting this wrong, Cole, but on about the day that he was being impeached. And even at that time of heightened partisanship, there was broad agreement about the importance of religious freedom. Today, I'm afraid, in the United States at least, that type of uncontroversiality and unanimity no longer exists. All right. Thank you very much. I appreciate your indulgence. Okay, what we'd like to do now is to invite this group of people whose names are here in front to come down, to take a seat, and we'll ask them to give just brief 2 or 3 minute reflections on the symposium. So we've invited Juan Jacobo Perez Cornelio, advisor to the government of Mexico. Cole chose this one, I think, because he did not want to be the only person stumbling over pronunciation. But we've invited Thoko Nonle Jeanette Mikwanzi Lova, the chairperson of the Commission for the Promotion and Protection of the Rights of Cultural, Religious, and Linguistic Communities. We've invited Jose Bizon, the ecclesiastical advisor for ecumenism and interfaith dialogue from the Archdiocese of Sao Paulo, and the director of the House of Reconciliation, Judge J. Clifford Wallace, Senior Judge and Chief Judge Emeritus of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit, Surinder Singh Kandari, Director of the Guru Nanak Darbar, and Evans Sufrant. So I think we're going to need 1 or 2 more chairs. Could I get some help bringing, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. We need at least 1 more chair. Okay, we have this one here. I think we're going to, with this, do we have a chair for everyone? I don't need a chair. I'll stand here.
Over there. Oh.
It's only fitting that we render our oldest and most distinguished delegate to someone who looks like he's going to eat his peas right off the dinner table. All right, let's go in the order that I introduced you. Juan, let's begin with you. Juan? Yeah, please.
Quisiera iniciar
I would like to begin
con unas de las máximas
with one of the biblical maxims of the abundance of the heart. The mouth speaketh.
Vive un científico norteamericano
There was an American scientist in America, Francis Fukuyama.
ha editado un texto que ya
He had imprinted a text of several years ago in circulation, which is called Confidence or Trust. Surely many of you know it.
confirmar el día de hoy
And I would like to reaffirm today that these 25 years of this symposium,
que hoy celebramos
that today we celebrate,
está a punto de concluir.
and that it is almost to conclusion,
Es porque esta universidad,
is because this university,
esta facultad,
this school,
esta iglesia
this church
ha generado confianza,
has generated trust.
confianza en 5 continentes
Trust in 5 continents
hoy representados aquí.
represented herein.
Son varias las lecciones, ¿no?
There are many lessons, not just one,
La que he aprendido,
that I have learned during these days.
pero yo quiero decirles a
But
los de la Facultad de Derecho,
I would like to say to the law school
darle universidad,
of this honorable university
que han escogido la mejor parte.
that they have chosen the better part.
Es la mejor parte,
And what is the better part?
sin duda,
No doubt,
la mejor parte
the best part
es mejor
is better
servir
to serve
que servir.
than to be served.
Los hombres y mujeres de estos 5 continentes,
The men and women of these 5 continents, of different religions, of different languages,
de diferentes formaciones
of
académicas,
different academic persuasions,
acciones,
of different actions in their daily living,
sin duda,
no doubt,
doctorales
doctors
llenas de gran emoción,
and full of great emotion,
en donde hemos podido
in which we have been able
recipiendarios
to receive
de sus conocimientos
of their knowledge, their experiences,
servirán
will serve us, to all of us, to continue forward.
Me complace saber
I am pleased to know
acciones
the expressions
del embajador Samuel,
of the Ambassador Samuel yesterday
jefe de la oficina
as director of the Office of Religious
del presidente,
Affairs in this administration of President Trump,
en donde hay un nuevo impulso
in which we have a new
religiosa
emphasis in religious freedom not only in the United States,
sino están convocando
but also they are inviting all countries to join them.
como decimos en México,
As we say in Mexico,
quizá en Brasil,
and perhaps in Brazil,
el balón está en nuestra cancha.
the ball is on our side.
Yo quiero exhortarlos, comentarles
I would like to exhort you and to comment with the greatest freedom, friendship, and faith to this university.
como dijo, y nos sigue diciendo,
As it was stated and continues to be said and will always tell us our Lord Jesus Christ.
en el mundo
In the world,
tendréis aflicción.
you will find tribulation.
En mí,
Trust in me.
yo he vencido al mundo.
I have overcome the world.
Ustedes tienen que tener, como lo han
You have to have, as you have had these last 25 years, trust. Afflictions will come, but have trust. And I conclude.
sigan adelante.
Continue forward.
En este humilde servidor,
In this humble servant, you will find a warrior ready to be with you.
que Dios bendiga
May God bless
hombres y mujeres
men and women
de esta universidad.
in this university to be with you. Thank you very much.
All right, let's go ahead with Jose Bizon.
Como é bom, como é
How
agradável.
good it is, how pleasant it is to be united as brothers and sisters,
Salmo 130.
as we read in Psalms 63.
Provenientes de diferentes países,
We come from different countries, from different religions. We reflect on the human dignity, freedom of religion and belief. We heard here from this pulpit stories of religious intolerance, physical and mental violence. But we also heard beautiful stories and experiences of actual acts in favor of freedom, of religious freedom, and human dignity.
ao sairmos daqui,
As we leave this place,
sairemos diferente de quando chegamos.
we will be different than when we came, knowing the importance of our actions
Nossa atuação pessoal
and how we personally act,
e atuação
of how action and reaction of our religions,
nossas universidades,
of our universities,
a exemplo da BU,
which should follow the example of BYU. Organizations who defend all peoples, as we read in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which we all know, and of which we have reflected upon these last few days.
somos chamados
We have been called, we all have been called to be builders of bridges,
a construir pontes,
to build bridges,
encurtar distâncias,
to shorten distances,
promover conhecimento,
to promote knowledge,
superar preconceitos
to overcome prejudice,
e contribuir
and to contribute
à boa convivência
to a well-being and peace among different religious traditions and denominations, Christian denominations.
Fica aqui o nosso agradecimento
We are very thankful in the name of the Brazilian Committee. We are thankful for the Law School of BYU
em organizar
to organize, to put together this, the 25th section,
e religião.
to discuss freedom in religion and law. We're thankful to all those who participated, the academic group and to accept us, to receive us, and to give us in a way that we as an institution, be it religious, academic, organizations, that we are called, wherever we may be, whatever our reality may be, based on the Declaration of Human Rights, as it completes now 7 years, to put into action whatever is possible, to follow based on what we hear here, and that we may not be exempt personally to be builders of bridges before conflict and situations that may allow us to promote solutions that they may be friendly solutions. May God bless all of you, your religious community, and this university, as well as the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, who has provided us this opportunity. Thank you very much.
All right, next we'll hear from Judge Cliff Wallace.
I started coming to these sessions longer ago than many of the students that help you were born upon this earth. A quarter of a century I have been attending these wonderful sessions, focusing upon religion and what it may mean to me, but more importantly, what I can do for it. What occurred was that some 40 years ago, I became interested in how courts function, how they can do better, not their law, but how they can be more efficient. It was coming to these sessions, as I reflect back, that I understood why that was important. No matter what the human right is, it's not a right until you have an order. That's how it's enforced. And so I saw my role in coming to these to not only to understand freedom of religion and belief more deeply, to understand its permutations, its effect, but to work with courts so that they could enforce those rights. And so this has been my quest, it's been my interest, and it's been my glory and my duty. I think sometimes we forget some of the rub-off value that comes from these. It's a nice place to come to. We get to think good thoughts. But there's an additional value that takes place because of our participation. Let me give you an example. Chief Justice Jilani of the Pakistan Supreme Court wrote an opinion 2 years ago, which is, from a Muslim country, a very remarkable opinion. In that opinion, he stated that it was unconstitutional for the government or any actor to discriminate against minority religions. He went on not only to show that it was unconstitutional under the Constitution, but quoted statements of the Prophet Muhammad that it was un-Islamic to do so. And because of his very deep conviction, he was willing to step out in a very hazardous place. He got the courage to do so, in my view, from associating with people here where he could get a greater vision that religion just isn't simply an inner belief, it's outward action that he took. And so today in Pakistan, they're struggling, of course, with how they will get along with that decision, which now protects Christian minorities, at least from the court's viewpoint, but there's an additional conversion that's needed from the activity. But think of the rub-off value that took place. He came to one of these conferences and then a second one, and then he walked around Brigham Young University here with me, and he says, "Where's the trash?" And I said, we don't do trash here. We teach people to put trash in trash cans. He said, oh. A little later on, he said to me, how do you get these people to dress like human beings? I said, well, they learn it in their home, their religious homes. They learn it. Oh, I think I'm going to have my son come here. I said, now, Chief Justice Gilani, you have to understand, if you bring a Muslim to this campus, there's going to be 25,000 missionaries trying to change his religion. And Chief Justice Gilani said, I think he'll be safe here. And he came, he graduated in business, he went back home and married a nice Muslim girl. But you see, what happened was a rub-off value of what he learned, not only believed, but trusted. Showing it not only by his life's son, the son of his life who sent him, but to go out and do what a judge should do, a focus upon this fundamental right, even in a country like Pakistan. I am greatly indebted to my good friends, Cole and Brent, who've put up with me over these years, and for the great amount I learned about what can be done in life if we focus beyond ourselves and try to accomplish not just a belief, but a change not only in ourselves, but in our friends, our associates, to make a difference. At the end of the day, no one's going to put very much on our tombstone. At the end of the day, life will be worthwhile as we look back and say, I made a difference. That I took the truths that I learned, that I did my best to not only live them, but to help others to live them, to teach, to encourage, to inspire. Fortunately, I have a very beautiful wife who's my partner, my inspiration, and together we've had a great experience. I'm going to be turning 90 this year. Someone asked me how long I'm going to continue this work overseas, working with countries. And I said, till Father calls me home. We all have the same Father, the same God. We're really brothers and sisters. All we need to do is act like that, and then help our other brothers and sisters to enjoy what we enjoy: faith, dignity, opportunity, and one day to return to the God we love.
Thank you, Judge Wallace. That was beautiful. We appreciate your sharing those thoughts with us. Next, we'll hear from Surinder Singh Kandari. Surinder.
Thank you, Brett. Good evening, everybody. I'm an Indian living in Dubai for the last 42 years. I'm grateful to BYU and the Church of Jesus Christ and the Latter-day Saints to invite me for this symposium and conference. In the last 2 days, I've learned a lot, I've been educated a lot, and I met some very important people, for which, when I go back home, I'll cherish these memories of this place and this symposium. Thank you very much for inviting me. I've got a few points to mention here. I come from Dubai. Dubai has over 200 nationalities living in peaceful harmony and coexistence. And this is because the government of Dubai recognizes the otherness of others. It's very important that every human being is treated like a human being and gets the same respect. And I always believe if we all respect each other, because they say there's God in every human being. You respect human beings, you're respecting God. And we're all God's children. If you all respect each other, there'll be no conflicts, no problems. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Our concluding speaker will be Evan Souffant.
Je dis merci à cette grande communauté qui a invité Haïti à prendre part.
I thank this great community that has invited Haiti to come and take part in this international meeting, at this family reunion.
Le Luxembourg n'est pas de ceux qui portent la bonne nouvelle.
How beautiful are the feet of those who carry good tidings. This is the opportunity given to us as leaders, as representatives, to meet and think and together and ponder on a theme so important as the human dignity and freedom of religion. Since I come from a country in Haiti that has known slavery, is that what has inspired me, in conclusion, where dignity, human dignity is disrespected? It's more than chains in our feet and in our hands. We can break these chains, but when those chains are in our minds, in our psyche, it's difficult to get rid of those. As representatives and leaders, we are gathered together to lay the foundation and ask the basic question, a key question. And as I look at each other, I told myself, this is what I call globalization. The world is a village. And I told myself that the problem of human dignity and religious freedom is not a problem of underdeveloped countries, but it is really a world problem, the problem of a village that the world is. So, ladies and gentlemen, as leaders in charge, it is ours now. Since the problem is global, let's look for a solution together, a global solution, and that will bring freedom. And I would not be satisfied to leave without leaving you with this maxim. As we leave tomorrow or the day after, to come back to our usual activities, but don't leave without asking yourselves this question. After this symposium, what will I do? In what way will I help so that in my country, in my community, that a change may come, so that man may find again his dignity, his personality, so that the man in my home may live as I live myself. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much to each of these spokesmen. As I said before, I wish we could have invited everyone to have a turn at the microphone, but it would make for a long afternoon and evening. But let me ask you to join me in once again thanking them for sharing their thoughts with us. All right. If you want to return to the audience, I'd like to invite Professor Durham and for Professor Elizabeth Clark to come up, and we will work on our closing remarks for the conference. We'll first hear from my senior partner and dear friend, Cole Durham. Cole Durham is a graduate of Harvard College and Harvard Law School, served as a law clerk, and has been working here as a professor at BYU now for about 35 years. He welcomed me as a first-year professor 20 years ago, took me under his wing, and has mentored me and has treated me as a partner from the very beginning. It's my pleasure to turn the microphone to him for concluding thoughts and observations about the symposium that we've had over the last few days. Cole?
Well, I have to thank Brett. In part, I was at a conference about 3 weeks ago, and another professor and I were congratulated on having reached our 75th birthday. That was about 5 extra years that I didn't necessarily want. And I think trying to equalize that, Brett has given me 35 years here. It's actually been 42. So thanks, Brett. Good try. I have to say, as one gets older, these things time goes faster, and there's sort of a blur. There's so many things that have gone on during this conference that I think it will be hard to pull strands together. I hope you'll actually bear with me a little bit as I reflect back over the 25 years of the conference, and actually a little longer than that. I am actually 70 years old, so I was born in the same year as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. You can imagine that I don't have a lot of memory of those particular events. But I've been thinking about this, and in many ways, just thinking about where I was at different points when some of the landmarks in the human rights movement happened. So I was in a crib at first. I was in high school in 1963. This is not exactly the international human rights, but I remember when Martin Luther King gave the I Have a Dream speech. I remember the following year I had an opportunity to go to the UN, and I remember seeing the words of Isaiah carved on a wall there. They shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Neither shall nation lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore. And those words hit me with particular force, I think, as any of us who have been there, seen those words, and remembered the aspirations that are there. I wasn't conscious of the words of the international covenants that were being hammered out at the time. I remember in those years reading Plato, The Republic, the seventh book, The Allegory of the Cave, which most of you will surely have read, which one of the great images of philosophy, the call of philosophy to turn from the cave and go out and ascend toward the good. By the time the international covenants were opened for signature in '66, I was studying philosophy at Harvard and doing a lot of work on the architectonics of Immanuel Kant's philosophy with its focus on dignity and autonomy. Again, I was sort of working on the core. I haven't necessarily seen the details yet. In the 1970s, when I was in law school, I was somewhat more conscious of the work of some of my professors who were engaged in promoting, at that point, the international human rights that came into force in 1976, the year I started teaching here. I remember in retrospect that I never took a class on international human rights because at the time it struck me as fairy tale hour. That is, there was a dream of human rights, but it was sort of a hopelessly remote ideal given geopolitical realities. My early years as a law school professor were spent in the shadow of the Cold War, writing about religious freedom from a comparative law perspective, but having limited hope that this would actually be relevant within the communist bloc. And then the wall came down in Berlin, just 3 weeks after I had been elected as the Secretary of the American Society of Comparative Law. And these two events pulled me into a maelstrom of legal change that swept Eastern Europe in the 90s, but also in part by ripple effect, many other parts of the world, including South Africa, Mexico, and many other parts of the world. Now, I remember one particular occasion I had in those years in the 90s. I remember a lot, but one will have to do. I was meeting with the head of religious affairs in Romania. I met with 2 or 3 at that time. I remember that one of them, I thought it was quite interesting. He was a specialist in Dracula, and I always thought it was interesting. He was a history professor, that he was in charge of religious affairs. And I think he's the one. I was there in the summer that they were working on the Constitution of Romania, and I asked him what he thought the Romanian Constitution would look like. And he said, it would look like the European Convention, which of course looks like the international instruments. Otherwise, we would be a laughingstock. And when he said that, I realized that human rights had really come of age. That was not that there was any perfection of implementation, far from it, but there was a new reality. The UDHR by this time has become, even for countries that haven't adopted it, has become customary international law. So that there is some real power in these ideas emerging and developing over time. Now, as I've looked back over this conference, I've found myself thinking hard about the idea of dignity. How can one communicate its significance? This is really a domain in which ordinary language fails, and the only hope is metaphor. The risk of metaphor is that metaphor is always inaccurate and inadequate in part, but what it lacks in clarity is sometimes made up in power. With that qualification in mind, let me describe the metaphor that has come to my mind. Over the years, traveling in and out of these mountain valleys where we find ourselves this afternoon, I've realized that I'm a child of the mountains. My ancestors were in the first wagon train that entered Salt Lake Valley in 1847. Others were in the famous Martin Handcart Company that suffered the worst disaster that happened on the Western Trail in American history. Fortunately, my great-grandfather and great-grandmother survived. I remember coming home from college and having my eyes get stuck on the mountains whenever I looked up. The mountains were the ground upon which I lived, an objective that I sometimes climbed. Any of you who know me will know it was not too often, but always the background of my life. I think that dignity is the mountain of our moral life. For the most part, we are like the children of Israel, gathered at the time of Moses at the foot of Sinai, walking around, not doing too much to climb. We talk of law, of duty, and of rights, but all too often we wander to and fro without ascending. But dignity is the towering backdrop of our conversations. It's the foundation of our rights. It's a reminder that our moral life is lived in arid foothills, but we are called to high places. Reflection on human dignity is part of what calls us from Plato's cave to the ascent toward the good. Now, a year or two, one of the many contributions that Brett Scharfs has made to my life is he talked me out into moving from my office where I'd been for 39 years on the 4th floor where I had a scenic view of an air conditioning unit to a 5th floor office that had floor-to-ceiling windows looking at the mountains. Now, that was really beautiful, but there was a problem. Under the mountains was the parking lot, which wasn't too scenic. So I like computer screens, so I put them in a position to block the parking lot. That was pretty good. But by this time, I was old enough that I needed to use computer glasses so I could read and see my computer. But there was a problem. when I then looked up to the mountains, they were like an impressionistic picture. I could sort of tell they were there, but so the solution was I finally broke down and got trifocals so that I could see the mountains too. Now, in some ways, I think that although many of you do not have the, I don't know what you call it, the benefit, the disadvantage of being 70, and you probably don't need trifocals yet, I wonder if we don't need kind of trifocals in our lives as we wrestle with the concept of dignity. That is, I think it's really important that we be able to read what each other are writing and thinking about these notions and their implications for the fields of human rights in which so many of us spend our lives. And we need to be able to use the computer focal length, which is a little different as you find as you get older, to see all the things that are coming in through high technology. For some of you, social media. I'm a little slower on that too. But we need the longer vision glasses that will now enable us to see the mountains, to see dignity, to see the contours, the pathways. And we'll see different things, we'll see different perspectives, but we need that longer view. Some years ago, I climbed Mount Timpanogos, which is the great mountain to the east. I did this fortunately with my son-in-law and daughter. As we climbed higher, different views opened up, and that's one of the things about climbing. As you get higher, as you get better at implementing things, you see more, and as you accomplish more, you see that there's much more to do. When you climb Timp, you get to a certain point which is called the saddle, and from there up, you're following this little path about this wide with a mere 2,000-foot drop-off on the side. And it turned out that my fear of heights kicked in. And this was a problem because as I looked down, I really started getting dizzy. So what I had to do is look at the feet of my son-in-law ahead of me, and I told him, do not go too fast. This was a long hike. But we made it. I think I was sort of leaning against the mountain wall, and as I listened to Brett this morning laying out some of the work he's done and I've been able to contribute to in minor ways, thinking about this kind of document on dignity, there is a way that we reach points in our lives when there are a lot of tension. It can cause disequilibriums of different kinds, and we need to be able to go back and sort of touch the face of dignity and go forward. I can't remember which of the speakers who just spoke said this, but this is another Isaiah passage. How beautiful upon the mountains are them that bring good tidings. So the feet of my son-in-law and daughter were really beautiful that day. Sometimes we need to follow in other people's footsteps. Sometimes we need to be the people who are walking ahead. But I think that's really very much what we need to do. Now let me come back to this conference and the 25th anniversary. 25 years ago, I had a dream. It was humbler in many ways than Martin Luther King's, though it had a common ground in human dignity. I dreamed that it might be possible to create a tradition of having annual conferences that could attract leading scholars, government officials, and practitioners from around the world to share experience in trying to ascend toward a continually better implementation of freedom of religion or belief, thereby also advancing human dignity. In the early years, we had extremely limited funding. We pooled resources with many other academic institutions around the country, but we made a start. What you have experienced over the past 2 days is an outgrowth of that early dream. What you have seen is the result of the dedication consecration, and work of people far too numerous to mention. In some ways, I suppose I pay tribute to them by not mentioning them, although they deserve to be mentioned. They know who they are, how much they have done, what they've sacrificed. And they see the beginnings of the seeds of what has been sown. Because what we're seeing here is always a beginning. It's impossible to attend these sessions without realizing how far we have to go on working on these issues. I'm just back from a conference where we're talking about the problems of refugees. Refugees have religious freedom problems, 75 million of them. Problems with food for children, problems with education, problems of so many kinds that depend in critical ways on religious idealism, in part, finding ways for the religious sector to work with the public sector, and that really depends on finding credible religious freedom protections. Well, the dream goes on. It's not merely about holding conferences, it's about building the relationships. One of the things you realize as you work in this field is that so much of what really happens depends on relationships, and that's one of the reasons that we've attached tremendous significance to having people come here and to the ongoing significance of these relationships. Well, let me go back to I'm going to read the verse in Isaiah that's right before the plowshares, the swords into plowshares. It's a verse that says, "Come ye and let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob. And he will teach us of his ways, and we will walk in his paths. For out of Zion shall go forth the law, and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem." We are the children of the mountains of this world. They are daunting, seemingly impassable. They are also awesome, inspiring reverence. We see precipices around us, but as we climb, we also sometimes see the sun rising above the hills, casting light over the variegated richness of our world. Thank you for being with us and spending some days walking in paths of these mountains and wrestling with us of how to better walk these pathways with our fellow brothers and sisters around the world. If we have learned something more about the mountain of dignity, this time is well spent. Thank you.
All right, now it's my pleasure to introduce the mastermind and the energy behind this gathering, my colleague and friend, Elizabeth Clark. I thank Judge Wallace because Elizabeth was a law clerk to Judge Wallace, and so he can take credit for the word that I use to describe Elizabeth, which is omnicompetent. There's very little, perhaps nothing, that she cannot do. And the work that she does in putting this gathering together among the many other responsibilities that she has at the center is remarkable. We're proud to count her as our graduate, and I'm proud to count her as my colleague and friend. Elizabeth, let's give you the final word.
Thank you. The very generous introduction. It's such a joy to see you all here. For the last year, you've been names on paper, ideas, thinking through who would make sense to bring, who should we invite, how can we put this together in a way that will come in a way that blesses and helps people throughout the world. And I'm grateful for all of you for accepting the opportunity to come here and for giving of your time and your talents. More than anything, I'm grateful for you and grateful for you being part of this endeavor together. I also want to share a few other thank yous at the outset, so please bear with me. This event is not a one-person or one small group endeavor. There's so many people who've worked very, very hard to bring this about, and I'd like to recognize them. I'd like to recognize our International Advisory Council. They're people who have donated so much of their time and resources to make what we do possible. I'm grateful for our audiovisual team, our technical team, who've arranged a possibility of having interpretation in all these languages. For our student volunteers who've picked people up at the airport, who've sat around at the last minute to wait and be there to be of service, and who would do it all without pay and cheerfully. They amaze me and I learn from them. I'm grateful for our interpreters upstairs who have been working very hard and doing their very best to make it possible for real communication to happen across cultures and across languages. I'm grateful especially for our executive committee students, the ones with the little red tags, who are the ones who have actually done all the real organizing. And Deborah Wright, Charmin Blood, and those up in our center who have been working on this many more hours than I. So please join me in thanking these groups. I have one announcement that I do need to make. As you exit, there'll be copies of a book with the pictures that you've seen hanging around on the walls. That's where they originally come from, and would like to invite all of the delegates to take one if they so choose. If you're not a delegate but would like one, you can put your name on the list, and if we have extra, we'll share. But we want to make sure all the delegates and conference participants get that. I just want to share one or two thoughts on the theme, and I'll be brief and let you all get home and get back to the hotel and go to dinner. But I'm grateful for the chance to think together about questions of dignity and freedom of religion or belief. To me, these are two questions that strike at the core of what it means to be human. The dignity of all people, regardless of their race or religion or gender or background or status as an immigrant or prisoner. They strike at the heart also of what it means to respond to one's tradition, one's family, the call of one's conscience, the light that one has in one's life. This is something aspirational, fortunately something, as Cole mentioned, that is increasingly of value and importance in the practical policy of the world. But as I've been thinking about this, there's two stories that I wanted to share. One of them is a story that came to mind just now when Brett was trying to find chairs for everyone. I said, is there a chair for everyone? And poor Judge Wallace got the little chair. There's a story that Eileen Barker, a professor at London School of Economics, who's received the British Empire's highest award, the Order of the British Empire, this is a story she tells. She was approached by someone who attended at a university in the United Kingdom. This particular university had a policy of recognizing certain religious traditions so they could cooperate appropriately with them, including giving them a room for worship. But this particular group came, and they were a new one, and they weren't recognized by the university. And so they went to her to see if she could intercede on their behalf. And so she went and asked the university officials, well, can you help me understand why you don't think they're a religion? And when they were pushed a little bit, they said, well, I'm sure they're a religion, but we just don't have enough rooms. Sometimes we recognize faith groups for what they are, and sometimes we limit our willingness to see and expect them to fit into our metaphorical rooms, into the chairs we have available, and don't realize how we can add more chairs. Or sometimes we want to have junior chairs too for our most senior and respected judge. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, in the very first article, has this wonderful statement that I'll just repeat it again because it's worth it. All human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. They are endowed with reason and conscience and should act towards another in a spirit of brotherhood, or may I add, sisterhood. For me, that brings to mind a song that in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, we teach our very youngest children. This is one of the first songs they learn. It's one that is the most popular. It's sung and translated throughout the world. And the title of it says, I am a child of God. There are many bases for understanding human dignity, and I am grateful for the fact that there are so many overlapping bases of coming from different belief traditions and non-belief. But for me, as a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, human dignity comes from the fact that I understand us to be children of God, literally brothers and sisters, wherever we are and whoever we are. I'll close with a final story about this that Shimon Peres, the former Prime Minister of Israel, used to tell. And he would say he was told it by a Muslim leader. But the story is about a Jewish rabbi who was talking to his two friends. And they come to him and they say, Rabbi, how do we know when the night is over and the day has begun? And he would sat and thought, and he says, well, when you look into the distance and you can tell a sheep from a goat, that is how you know the night is over and the day has begun. And I said, oh, good. They come back to me again later and they say, Rabbi, we're still confused. How do we know the night is over and the day has begun? And he said, well, when you can look into the distance and you can tell an olive tree from a fig tree, then you know the night is over and the day has begun. But they came again and asked the rabbi a third time. They said, Rabbi, how do we know the night is over and the day has begun? And he said, when you can look into the face of a woman and say, she is my sister, then you know the night is over and the day has begun. When you can look into the face of a man and say, he is my brother, then you will know the light has come. Thank you.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Several years ago, at a conference in Indonesia, a colleague of Tora Lindholm gave a definition of successful work. You could probably give it to us right here, Tora. She said the definition of successful work is that it enables you to do more and better work. And that's the call that I have felt here over the last few days. I feel that our work has been successful because it has called us and enabled us to do more and better work. And we look forward to walking forward with you, in partnership with you, in collaboration with you, onwards, scaling the mountains, metaphorical and real, that lie before us. Thank you very much. God bless you. See you at dinner tonight at 7.